Okay, we are live. Welcome, everybody, to the Queen's Podcast Lab Learning Seminar. For those of you who don't know us, we're a group of students and faculty, mostly at Queen's College, who are interested in content creation and managing or running creative enterprises. My name is Joseph Cohen. I'm a professor in the sociology department here at Queen's College and co-director of the Podcast Lab. And today I am extremely excited. We have an amazing guest. This is a creator who I really admire, and he works in a space that a lot of us dream of working in, sports. Actually, now he's pivoting to the one space that is even more popular among the students that we teach, which is culture. But Ben Lindbergh is an acclaimed baseball writer and podcaster. He is a former editor-in-chief of Baseball Prospectus, a publication that has served as a waypoint for many analysts' journey into Major League Baseball front offices and some great major sports media journalism outlets. He is also a pioneer in baseball podcasting. He is creator and host of Effectively Wild, a nationally ranked sports podcast. Which many of you baseball fans, I'm sure, will know. And he writes for The Ringer, another successful sports and culture outlet. And I just want to put in, he also he's written several books, but there's one that's really terrific that I have to find a way to teach to my data analysis grad students. The only rule is it has to work. It's a stats nerd. It's a baseball stat nerd's dream. Mr. Lindbergh and his colleague, two numbers guys, got to be general manager of an indie baseball team. And the book is an account of what they experienced. And it's just terrific. So he's a very prolific creator. I'm a big fan of his work. Thank you very much for joining us, Ben Lindbergh.
Thank you very much for that intro. That was very flattering. Happy to be here.
So start off, we're talking about your job as a sports content creator. Is that how you see your job? Do you see your job as are you a writer, a journalist? How would you describe what you do to people?
It's a bit of both, right? And it kind of is all over the industry now, right? Where you start out doing one thing and then hopefully you're able to do more than one thing. That is certainly beneficial. Of course, if there's one thing you prefer to do, there are still ways to do that. But it seems like whatever you come up as, you inevitably kind of get pushed toward or gravitate towards other media. So I was a writer exclusively. I was an English major. I set out to do writing and editing, and then that turned into podcasting and occasional TV work. And I didn't have training to do those sorts of things. So it just kind of came with experience to the extent that it's come at all. But I still love writing and editing, and that is the bulk of my work at The Ringer, certainly. But I do a lot of podcasting too. So yeah, you have to wear a bunch of hats, and hopefully they fit fairly comfortably after enough time.
A lot of our students want to know, how did you get started? Like, what was the first step when you got out of college?
Well, initially I thought that I wanted to work in baseball in some capacity. All I had really ever imagined myself doing was either writing or working for a baseball team. And I guess I ended up kind of combining those things. But I initially had envisioned myself as, the future GM that everyone thinks that they'll be when they read Moneyball. And so I did some internships with sports companies and sports teams and baseball teams, and that was rewarding and eye-opening in some ways. And I was with the Yankees as an intern in 2009 when they won the World Series, the last time they did. Maybe they never should have let me go. But it was, I think, revealing in the sense that although I learned a lot, I didn't feel like I had the skill set to stand out necessarily. As an English major, it's more useful for someone who is doing English major things than working for a baseball team. And I was conversant with stats and probability. And so I kind of went into sabermetric analytical type of baseball writing. But once I was with a team, I was not really the stat head because there were people who had computer science degrees and advanced math degrees and actual literal rocket scientists. And so suddenly, being somewhat stat savvy for an English major was not cutting it. And I hadn't been a high level player or anything that would lend itself to a scouting job, for instance. So I figured I could kick around and maybe keep finding internships with different teams in different cities. And a lot of people do that. And eventually, hopefully, they catch on and maybe it works out. But I missed writing, which I had started to do by that point with Baseball Prospectus and that interaction with the audience. And so when that internship ended, I just went back to that at BP and at Bloomberg Sports and worked my way up at Baseball Prospectus, and then eventually went to Grantland, which was an ESPN site at the time. And then when the founder of Grantland, Bill Simmons, started The Ringer, I eventually went over there after a little interlude at 538. So I've bounced a bit from place to place, not nearly as much as some people do. You really have to be pretty flexible and itinerant in this industry these days. But I've been able to work at places that really let me pursue passions and do a bunch of different things. And I'm happy with how it's worked out.
So it sounds like you started with the passion for baseball, and then you found a way to be part of that world with the skill set that you had. Is that kind of what you did?
Yeah, I'd say so. And I never set out to be a sports writer, really. I kind of fell into that. I had never really imagined myself as a beat writer, a baseball writer. I had grown up as a baseball fan and liked reading baseball books, but I imagined myself more as a fiction or science fiction author potentially
Yeah.
than someone who wrote about sports. But I was really interested in baseball and I had that writing background and some proclivity for that. So I started doing that and found that I had some knack for it, it seemed, and enjoyed it and got better at it and really liked reading all those things. And so it was a thrill for me to write that stuff too. And I was never totally married to the idea of just solely being a sports writer. And so I've tried to branch out a bit wherever I was. That was one reason I went to Grantland, is that it was not exclusively a baseball site and I could contribute on the culture side there too. And then the Ringer, the editors there knew me and had the confidence that I could do that. And so everywhere I've gone, I've tried to make myself more valuable, I guess, which is useful during, say, an MLB lockout. That there are other things that I can cover and other ways that I can contribute. But I also just value the variety and the challenge of just being on multiple beats or writing about things that I haven't covered before. So sports and baseball writing is still rewarding, but I just love being able to do different things from week to week if possible.
I guess that's one thing that young people don't understand is that your interests will evolve over a lifetime. Maybe being interested at the beginning is good because then you're really dedicated to creating on your topic, and then you learn the business and you're able to branch out maybe as you mature.
Yeah, I think that's true. And these days, people change careers multiple times typically over
Yeah.
the course of their life and certainly move a lot within their career. And if you find something that you love to do and you can do it your whole life and feel fulfilled, then that's wonderful. But I think a lot of people end up going down different roads, whether by necessity or just because their interests evolve. And I do think that even if you are focusing on one area, even if you're just writing about baseball, I think it is really helpful to have that background, just the multidisciplinary approach and knowing things about various subjects. I mean, my favorite baseball writer growing up and still is Roger Angell of The New Yorker. And he was someone who really brought that sensibility of someone who knew a lot about a lot of things. And he just happened to end up writing about baseball. But he could bring in all sorts of literary allusions and make comparisons and analogies. And so if you've only done one thing your whole life, it's like for an athlete, often it's helpful to play multiple sports up to a certain point so that you develop that framework and that foundation and multiple skills. So I find that that's useful for a writer and a media member as well.
We have a question. One of our sports writers at the school newspaper couldn't make it, and he had a whole list of questions. It's Holden Velasco, by the way, just in case, because I know Holden's going to watch us later on YouTube Live. And one of Holden's questions was, concretely, for like a young sports writer like him, what is a smart move in early career management? What would you advise them to do to get a foothold in the business?
Well, it depends somewhat on the sport, but I'd say that there are probably a number of things that would make you more attractive regardless. Obviously, one is maybe knowing multiple languages, especially in a sport with such an international player pool and audience as baseball, for instance. If you study Spanish or know it already, that is something that can give you a big leg up and enable you to do a broader range of stories and talk to more players and just get better reporting and build those relationships. And I think in virtually every sport now, it's helpful to have some handle on the statistical side of things. So that doesn't mean you have to be a math major, but it can be helpful to take a probability course or even learn a little bit of light coding, something that I've kind of dabbled in, but have never pursued as much as I still feel like I should have. But having that kind of background, I think, is helpful these days. Even if your main strength is writing, all teams and to a large extent players are pretty knowledgeable about those things these days. And that plays a large part in how teams are constructed and how athletes evolve. And so you kind of need to be able to speak that language a little, even just to understand the sport, I think. So those are probably two very broad things. And then just generally, I mean, I'm sure it's the most common piece of advice you get, but just reading a lot, just be familiar with the literature, with the research. You don't want to end up duplicating work that's already out there. You want to be able to build on it and hopefully learn from it, studying the craft of other writers and trying to figure out how they do what they do. I think early on in any writer's career, you tend to almost unconsciously emulate other writers that you've been reading. Yeah. And that can be helpful at first. You kind of kick yourself if you look at what you just wrote and you think, oh, I'm doing a poor impression of this writer that I've liked for a long time. But I think even just sort of trying to channel that voice and figure out, well, what works for them? What do I like about how they write? And if you can even mimic that, then maybe eventually I think you kind of grow out of that. You develop your own voice and you start, forging your own path instead of sort of imitating someone else's. But I think that's kind of a crucial stage that almost everyone goes through.
But it sounds like fundamentally, all of these are building blocks to just making articles that impress people. Like at the end of the day, is that what it's about? Just writing pieces that people love?
Mm-hmm. I think so. Ideally, that's what it's about. And hopefully that's something that enables you to make a living as well. But I still get a thrill out of that. I mean, that's still a big part of the pleasure for me, is just being able to put these thoughts out there and have people read them and hopefully enjoy them and respond and have a bit of back and forth. And I find that with podcasting, there's a bit of an intimacy maybe that is hard to cultivate when it's just writing. I think obviously people still appreciate good writing and, all of the forecasts of no one's going to want to read anymore. And, all of these dire prognostications about writing. I mean, certainly some of those things have come true, but I think there's still an appetite and a need for that. But podcasting, I've found doing Effectively Wild a few times a week and daily when we started out, that just seems to build a kind of connection to an audience that I think is tough to forge just through the written word. It can be done, but if you're in someone's ears every day, during their commute or as they're falling asleep, kind of in these intimate moments, and there's a parasocial relationship that tends to develop, I guess, where you feel like the person maybe a bit better than you do. And I certainly have that myself as someone who listens to a lot of podcasts, but I have found that to be rewarding in a different way. Just that interaction as a podcaster has been pretty fulfilling over the years.
For everybody else here, just for those of you listening, over the course of this, if you have a question of Mr. Lindbergh, you can put it in the chat window, either on YouTube Live or here on Zoom. Or if you want to ask it yourself, just use the hand emoji for Zoom. How did you get started on Effectively Wild? And what did you learn about successfully starting up a podcast?
Gosh, a lot. Well, I never would have anticipated that I'd still be doing it after all this time. It's been almost 10 years and it's changed sites and it's changed co-hosts multiple times and it's now listener supported. So it's gone through all sorts of evolutions and has become more professional, probably from a production standpoint over the years, as all podcasts have. But we started it almost on a whim, really. It was, I was an editor at Baseball Prospectus at the time and started it with Sam Miller, who was a co-editor with me at the time. And we just felt like it was something the site needed and could benefit from. And it was something we hadn't really done before. And we just felt like it filled a niche and a need for the site and didn't know whether we would be good at it. And I'm not sure we were good at it at first, but it's evolved very much over the years, so that initially it was, we'll just do this every day and it'll be 15 minutes. And now it's morphed into, much longer episodes a little less frequently. So the format is completely different, but we learned a lot, obviously, just from a production standpoint, from a recording standpoint, technically, the importance of having the right gear and the right software and all of that. But I think just as a host, also, I have hopefully learned things over the years where, again, I had no broadcast training and I wouldn't say I'm a natural public speaker. And so I, go back and listen to early episodes or don't go back and listen to them because at the time, I was talking, I guess, the way I would when I'm just at home, kind of talking casually, not really conscious of the fact that I'm an entertainer, right? I have to, have a broadcast voice to some extent, not being phony or fake, like it's me and it's my thoughts and my personality, but maybe in a more elevated way than if it were just kind of casual conversation. So I just became more conscious of, hey, I'm trying to entertain and keep people's interest here, in addition to just saying whatever's on my mind, just off the cuff. So I think preparation wise and just, speaking wise, and I edited and produced the show for many years as well. And so that taught me a lot, I think, about my own verbal tics and some of the little time wasters that I would stick in there. And when it took me hours to edit out a bunch of ums and ahs and awkward pauses, I found that helped me filter that out of my speech eventually, if only because it would save me a lot of time on the back end. So that's just a product of doing hundreds of episodes over the years. And really, I don't know that there's a shortcut to that. So it might just be about the reps and the number of hours that you put into those things. But really, I don't know that we ever, we never advertised or promoted the show in any major way. It was just kind of a word of mouth thing. And we make the show that is interesting to us. And that's really all you can do. I guess you could do something that is not interesting to you that you still think would be popular, but I wouldn't enjoy that very much. And I don't know that I would be able to maintain the enthusiasm for it. So we do it the way that we want to do it and that we would want to listen to as listeners. And we hope that the audience will be there. And I don't even look at metrics or anything, even though I'm sort of a stat head when it comes to baseball. I don't really look that closely at how many people read my articles or listen to my podcast. Just, I feel like that would get in my head probably. And I'm already doing the best job I can do. And if I were to look at something and see that it wasn't as well read as I would have liked it to be, I don't know that I could necessarily change things. Maybe I could. Maybe I should look at these things more and study what's working, but I just tend to write about what's interesting to me or talk about what's interesting to me. And so if the only solution to be more popular was to do something that I found less engaging, then maybe that would make me more money, but I don't know that it would make me happier.
Yeah. Ryan and I are interviewing chartered podcasters as part of this larger project. And we're under the impression that the creators' buy-in and the creators' continued desire to create is the critical factor. Because now you don't need money so much to run these media enterprises. So I think the idea of creating something that is satisfying to you personally is important, just to keep the thing running long enough to grow. Oh, that's awesome. What's your creative process? I mean, you've done a lot of work and you got a lot of projects on the go. Um, how does your work week like what does it look like and how do you organize and manage all those projects?
It's very unpredictable, which I like in some ways, and in some ways can be a pain. But I often don't know what my week will look like until it actually starts, and sometimes not until well after that. Obviously, if I'm working on a reported feature of some sort, then that's something that I'll have been doing interviews for and laying some groundwork for a while. But you just never really know from day to day. I try to get some degree of control over my schedule because I don't love it if I have to suddenly leap into action and do a blog or something when I was in the middle of working on something else. So I do value having some consistency and being able to tell what I'll be working on. But generally, I write maybe a couple times a week at this point and edit as well and do a few podcasts. And so it's all very seat of the pants, sort of. Sometimes I've been working on things for a while, but often I won't know what I'm writing about until the week starts and something happens and news prompts a response of some sort or an idea dawns. So it really varies. And I think you have to be kind of comfortable with that to work in the industry to some extent. Not that you should be working 24/7 or burn yourself out, but it's not the typical 9 to 5, go to an office type of job for most people, I think, who do what I do. So you do have to be a bit adaptable when it comes to that. I'm doing a podcast after I talk to you today, and I don't know exactly what time, and I don't know exactly what we'll be talking about. So I have a general idea of both of those things, but the specifics, we'll see. We'll do it live. So I think part of it is just you get comfortable, I think, with adapting on the fly after a certain number of years and a certain number of articles and a certain number of podcasts. And obviously, the first time you're doing those things, it's very momentous and there's a lot of stress associated with it, and you want everything to be perfect. Not that I don't want things to be perfect now, but I accept that they can't be. And so I try to do the best I can and try to plan ahead as well as I can. But just the business by its nature, I think, demands some flexibility.
Uh, okay, I got another question. Let's see. How do you come up with creative content that sticks out from other media outlets? This is another question from a student that sticks out in the same news cycle. So, what do you do? Like, how do you, more generally, you come up with a lot of content and you seem to be able to just get a steady stream. Like, you don't get, or I don't know if you wrestle with writer's block or things like that, but you do manage to produce a lot of stuff that is discussion worthy. How does somebody do that? Somebody who, might be a little more riddled by writer's block.
Mm. Yeah, I wish I had an easy solution for that. I don't know that there is one. I don't get writer's block in the sense that I know what I want to write about, but then end up staring at a blank page and just am unable to summon the words. That doesn't happen to me so much, but there are definitely dry spells when it comes to topics. And I think that's half the battle, if not more, is figuring out what you want to write about before you figure out how you're going to write about it. I think it helps now that there are so many things I can cover at the Ringer. And so if I'm out of ideas in one area, then there's always something else. If there's a MLB lockout and you're not bombarded with baseball ideas, well, I can write about video games or I can write about music or TV or whatever it is. There's always something happening, which can be a bit overwhelming because I feel some pressure to stay apprised of all of these things that are happening. And if you have one beat, I think it's easier to really be an expert and feel like you have a handle on it. Whereas if you're trying to do a bunch of different things, then you feel like you're always falling a bit behind, especially just with the quantity of music and TV and movies and video games. It's just such a deluge of content, right? So
Yeah.
I think in my current role, that's a a mixed blessing. It's hard in some ways to keep up, but it also gives me a greater range that I can pull from for topics. But when I was covering baseball exclusively, it's tough. If you're just writing about, say, a free agent signing or a trade, you may have to accept that what you say is not going to be brilliantly original and completely unlike what anyone else has ever said on that subject. There are certain cases where what you write about might not be so dissimilar from what other people write about. And that's okay, because you have to serve your site and your audience to an extent. But I think more and more I've tried to gravitate toward ideas that are not that kind of commodity where it's everyone will have a piece on this that falls in the same general bounds, right? And you have to do that to some extent, but it's tough to stand out. And I think when I started just having more of the sabermetric bent, and that knowledge helped me stand out a bit, because I could bring a statistical rigor to a topic, hopefully combined with engaging writing as well, but maybe provide some analysis that was lacking in most coverage. These days, that's hard to do too, because almost everyone, it seems, is familiar with those concepts and maybe is not doing the deepest dives when it comes to stats, but is at least familiar with advanced metrics and looks at things in a similar way, or at least knows how to look at things that way. So I really try to look for out of the box topics, which is hard. I mean, you can tell someone, hey, come up with ideas that no one else has. Well, easier said than done. I try to read a lot so that I know what is being written about a lot, and therefore I hopefully know what not to write about, and can look for something different. But it's definitely just something I've gotten better at over time. I think just that idea generation, because you do it long enough, these things just come to you, or hopefully, you think of things that you've done before that would apply in this new subject area, or you could adapt something that you've thought about before, or I feel like my mind forms opinions more easily than it used to, or crafts those opinions into topics that I can write about, kind of just consolidates things, condenses things into, well, instead of here are my many meandering thoughts on the subject, here's my take, if you want to put it that way. Here's my angle on this. And I think just the practice really has made me much better at that. And again, I don't know if there's something I could have told myself 10 years ago, or that I could tell a younger writer now and say, skip that whole practice part and just, go straight to the expertise. I'm not sure that's out there. But again, I'd say if you've identified other writers you think have some knack for that, then read what they do and try to backwards engineer it in a way. How do they come up with these ideas? Many writers are responsive and receptive to questions. So if you want to ask, hey, how did you get this idea? Often it's just sort of serendipitous. You stumble across something as you're working on something else, and it leads you down a different direction. Or once you have a bit of a following, I think the ideas come to you more readily because people reach out to you and suggest topics. Maybe it's PR people, or maybe it's readers or listeners who say, hey, did you hear about this? I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say on that subject. And then suddenly you have people supplying subjects to you, which, again, not something that when you're just starting out, you can necessarily have come to you. But I'm just explaining how it has become a bit easier for me over the years. It was not easy initially.
So you got to persevere, I guess. Ryan, you got a question.
Yes, thanks. This is all very interesting to me, especially because we're studying podcasts, and I'm a sports fan too. So I listen to a lot of sports podcasts also. And I've listened to The Ringer a lot. It's a pretty big platform for sports podcasting and all kinds of different subjects. What would you say is the benefit of being a part of a network like The Ringer? Would you suggest to podcasters starting out to join something like that if they can? What do you get out of it, really, you think?
I think it's helpful to have that ecosystem and that platform set up. I mean, for one thing, there's an infrastructure when it comes to production and recording. We have producers and very skilled ones who can handle all of that and make you sound smarter than you would on your own, and handle booking for guests. I mean, having that whole support system can be very helpful and can save you a lot of time and can make you sound better at what you do. And of course, there's promotion that comes with it. And you have hosts on one show saying, hey, listen to the hosts on that other show. And you have cross promotion, and you have people appearing on this podcast and that podcast, and it kind of cross pollinates. So yes, I would say if you can find a way to do that, then that would be great. Often you have to establish yourself before you can do that, and you have to kind of make yourself attractive to one of those networks and demonstrate that you can do this, that you have some track record, that you've been able to amass an audience of some sort, and hopefully they'll bring you on. So at Effectively Wild, we never really have been part of a network. We've been part of a site, Baseball Prospectus or Fangraphs, which are not enormous sites in the larger media ecosystem, but are well known among baseball fans. So again, if I had started that exact podcast just as someone with no platform, no starting point, then who's to say whether it would have ever caught on, or whether I would still be doing it, or whether it would have generated any revenue. I don't know. I'd like to think so. I'd like to think it would have found an audience anyway, but having a head start in that sense has been helpful. So I'd say even if you can't immediately get on the air and host your own show on a network like that, if you can find a way in somehow, and maybe it's as a writer, maybe it's as a producer, maybe it's as a social media person, if you can get in the door and become known to the people there, and maybe impress upon them that you have thoughts to share, that you have ideas, then I think it's possible to work your way in, even if you're not coming in day one as a established, famous media person with a big following. So it's tough. I mean, there are millions of podcasts out there, right? So how do you differentiate yourself unless you have a bit of that backing behind you? It's tough to do, and not getting any easier.
I got a chat question for you. How do you balance respecting the players on both the professional and personal level when giving your personal take about them?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's been a big obstacle for me, because I've never been someone who's going to come out and say, oh, this guy is garbage, kind of like your sports radio hot take type. So I think, people expect me to give, an evaluation of a player's performance at times. And if that performance is not great, then I will say so, but hopefully in a respectful way. I mean, I think there's a presumption, really, anyone who covers sports, that, well, all of these people, all of these athletes are incredible and are among the best in the world at what they do. So if we, critique their game, then we're talking about their performance relative to the other very best people in the world. And so we're not saying that they're bad at baseball. We're saying that they're not as good as the, 0.0001%, right? So I think you have to couch it and be conscious of the fact that these are people. They may be very talented and in some cases famous and wealthy people, but they are people and they do have feelings. And so I think it's good to be conscious of that. And there's been a larger awareness, I think, of the fact that players are human beings. They're not just a bunch of numbers. And, you'll see differences in the terms that people use to talk about players, where people won't say, oh, players are assets anymore. I mean, you might still hear that, but I think there has been a greater reluctance to speak about them like that, or the idea of the fantasy baseball auction draft, right? Like, that terminology has changed in recent years as people have become more mindful of these things, of the fact that these are human beings and they deserve to be valued for their labor, and not to be turned into commodities, right? And people who you are harassing on social media because they have a bad game. So I think it comes naturally if you try to be objective and fair in your analysis, and if you try to support it with stats, right? I mean, stats can be biased in some ways too, but if you say that so and so is in the 10th percentile of this metric or whatever, I mean, that might not reflect well on them, but it's not as if you are being excessively cruel. You're just sorting the leaderboard, right? So I think as long as there's a sense that you have done the research and you're basing your opinion on something meaningful and measurable, and you maintain the proper tone when imparting this information, I think you can't go wrong.
All right, we're actually coming near the end. I want to just make sure that Andy or David or Chris had a chance to ask something if you were interested.
Well, I'd just like to say, Ben, it's been a pleasure listening to you. You're really very thoughtful. And I agree with so much of what you said. It's good to try to be wide in your knowledge for a few reasons. As you mentioned, it gives you options to do other things. Gives you, it makes you more valuable, but also enriches the work that you do, bringing in other aspects of life to the work that you do. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Thanks. Yeah.
So let's first of all, it's been a real thrill to meet you, and I've learned. Oh, sorry, David, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I wanted to ask Ben, what were the steps you took to become a great sports writer, and what would you say are the struggles to becoming a great sports writer?
Gosh, well, thanks for suggesting I'm great, first of all, but I really think it started with just having a base of knowledge and familiarity with the subject matter and with writing. And certainly I had advantages. I had a good education when it comes to writing. I had a background in that. And so I was lucky in some respects. And when it came to applying it to sports, really, I just tried to read as broadly as I could and then tried to push myself, I guess, to do other kinds of coverage and to do more reporting. I don't think every piece needs to have a reported element necessarily, but I have found that to be helpful. And that was not something that came naturally to me. I wasn't naturally the most outgoing person. And I think almost anyone feels some sort of imposter syndrome or apprehensiveness when it comes to, say, walking into a locker room and talking to athletes, right? And you worry, am I going to say something silly and they're going to know that I'm a pretender here? And maybe you will, but probably everyone does. So I think you just have to be okay with that. And most people are pretty understanding, I've found. And other writers tend to be pretty supportive, I've found in most cases too. So I'd say, don't be afraid to ask people for advice, which I guess you're not because you just did. And I don't know whether I'm giving you useful advice or not, but I think other people will help to the extent that they can. And again, I don't know that all of it is so easy to boil down into here's how you do it and here's step one and here's step two, because if you could do that, then everyone would reach the point that they want to reach. And that's just probably not the case. But
yeah,
there are more ways to get there than ever. And whether it's video or audio or social media, I mean, I have colleagues or former colleagues who have just gotten their break through tweets or, there are all sorts of different ways that you can come to people's attention and show that you have a voice that stands out. And that's just something you have to work on, again, by just consuming as much as you can that will hopefully give you some sense of here's how other people do it, here's how I can do it. And then from that, you can sort of springboard into, well, here's how I can do it a little bit differently from other people do it, hopefully to stand out a bit. And, I've kind of gone in the generalist route where I try to cover a bunch of different subjects, not just because I think it makes sense, but also just because it's what I enjoy. But other people kind of go in the opposite direction and say, I'm going to be the absolute expert on this one single subject. And it might be a narrow subject, but if you're the go-to person when it comes to that, that might be all you need too. And if that is fascinating for you and it remains so, then that's perfectly fine also. So I guess just don't be bound to any particular path. I need to go to journalism school and get this degree or that degree or get this internship. I mean, I didn't go to grad school. I just felt like I want to write and I want to do the things I'm interested in. I didn't even work on my school paper or anything like that, which a lot of people do, and that can be great experience. But I just went right to, I want to work for Baseball Prospectus, and was able to get an internship there and kind of learn on the job to a certain extent. So there are just so many ways to do it, and so many more ways, I think, than there used to be, that it's hard to say, here's the way, which can be discouraging, but also encouraging, because you can make your own path and it might be something that no one else would have thought of.
Sounds like you're saying you got to put yourself out there. You just in any way you can, because you never know where your break's going to come from.
I think so, yeah. And, that maybe means that you have to be more of a self-promoter at times than you're comfortable with. And I'm not really inclined in that direction. And, I'm not tweeting all the time, and I'm not on every conceivable social media platform. So I sort of value my privacy to an extent too. And even though I do a ton of podcasts and appearances like this, if I'm not doing one of these things, I'm probably sitting there silently for hours at a time. So it's not the way I'm wired necessarily. So yeah, I think if you are a very public person and that comes naturally to you, that can be helpful. But I wouldn't want to say that you have to be, or that you can't succeed as an introvert too, because I would consider myself one, and I've kind of had to push myself not to be for isolated bursts, basically.
I know you're super low on time, but I got to ask this follow-up question. Because I remember years ago, you took scout training, right? You went to scout school and you
I did,
tried, and you were trying to be a GM for an indie team. And it's like you kind of jump straight into stuff, is my impression of you. Like you're a tryout guy.
Yeah, always with misgivings and hesitations, but sometimes you do have to make yourself do those things. And sometimes the discomfort that you feel can be good material. The book that you mentioned, The Only Rules It Has to Work, a lot of it is just about the fact that we were fish out of water and we did not feel comfortable. And so a lot of the book is about us feeling that way, right? And trying to figure out how to get over that. So I think you can embrace that and not pretend that you're, Mr. Cool who's comfortable in every situation, right? So if you have some uncertainty or some insecurity, then maybe be upfront about that at times. I think that makes sense too. But yeah, that kind of experiential writing can be pretty helpful. I'm never going to be a scout. I'm never going to be a GM. I'm never going to be an athlete, but maybe I can pretend to be. I can dabble. I can explain a little bit about what it might be like. So
get a taste,
I went to scout school and I wrote a series on that for Grantland, and I didn't aspire to be a professional scout. And I don't know if I had any special scouting acumen, but going through that program was fun and distinctive. And obviously a lot of people were not doing that. And so that was one of the early freelance projects I did for Grantland. And maybe that was one of the things that helped me get hired there full time. Because again, not everyone's going to be able to do that or be willing to do that.
Well, it generated great podcast material. I mean, you have listeners like me who remember it years later. So I guess it was good material. I know you're super busy, so we're going to let you go. I want to tell you it was really great. I'm very grateful for the time that you gave us, and I'm a huge fan of your work. I think you're a terrific creator. So it was a real thrill to meet you.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the invitation.
All right. Ben Lindbergh of The Ringer, creator and host of the Effectively Wild podcast. Thank you very much. I'm just going to end the stream to everybody. Thank you for joining us. All right. Okay, the stream is done. Thank you.